Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. The Bible tells us the death of his saints is precious to God. But when that saint is your 2-year-old son who drowned before your eyes, those words feel like salt in an open wound. How can something so devastating be precious to anyone? Today I'm opening the private letter I wrote in my darkest hour, when I couldn't pray, couldn't worship, couldn't even look at my Bible, when the platitudes failed and only raw truth remained. Brothers, this isn't about finding easy answers. It's about discovering how faith survives when it has every reason to die. Asterisk, what happens when the unthinkable becomes your reality? When the waters that were meant for joy become the grave of your greatest treasure? One moment your 2-year-old son is playing nearby, the next, that silence that no parent ever wants to hear. There he stands now, a father at the edge of a backyard pool. The same pool where neighborhood children once splashed and laughed. The same water that now divides his life into before and after. A mere 20 seconds, that's all it took. 20 seconds of distraction. 20 seconds that stretched into eternity. The memory plays in his mind like a horror film he cannot shut off. The frantic dive into the water. The small, limp body. His trembling hands performing CPR while his wife screams into the phone. Time warps and bends simultaneously, racing and standing completely still. The paramedics arrive, faces grim but professional. They take over with practiced precision, but their eyes already hold what he refuses to accept. The hospital corridor stretches endlessly, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, the antiseptic smell that will forever trigger this memory. And then that room, that sterile, cold room, where doctors speak words that don't make sense. We did everything we could. I'm sorry for your loss. Words that hang in the air like physical objects he wants to tear apart with his bare hands. And then comes the surreal aftermath. The sun rises the next morning, how dare it? The neighbor's lawnmower drones on. Doesn't the world know what happened? The physical world continues its indifferent march, while his inner world has completely collapsed. Breakfast must still be made. Bills must still be paid. The surviving children still need to be dressed. But nothing, absolutely nothing matters anymore. Then they come. The well-meaning visitors, with their rehearsed spiritual platitudes. God needed another angel. He's in a better place. Everything happens for a reason. Each comforting lands, like a stone thrown at an already bleeding heart. Their theological certainty in the face of his raw agony feels like another betrayal. Night after night. Sleep refuses to come. The darkness brings questions that circle like vultures. Didn't he specifically pray for protection? Hadn't he pleaded with God to watch over his children, especially around water? The prayers that once felt like faithful assurances now haunt him like broken promises. At 3 a.m., when the house is silent except for his racing thoughts, the questions turn accusatory. Was God distracted just like he was? Did God choose not to act? Is this punishment for some forgotten sin? Was his faith just a comfortable illusion all along? Then Sunday arrives. The church building that once felt like a sanctuary now looms like a courthouse. How can he enter the house of a God who could have prevented this but didn't? The songs of praise stick in his throat like shards of glass. The well-worn Bible verses about God's protection sound like cruel jokes. Where was divine intervention when water filled his son's lungs? Where was God when the waters took my son? This question burns in his mind as he kneels beside an impossibly small grave. The answer comes not in a thunderous revelation, but in a whisper that takes months to hear. He was there. Not as the cosmic vending machine of blessings you thought you knew, but as the God who also watched his own son die. This is where true faith begins, not in the shallow waters of prosperity and protection, but in the depths where only grace can sustain you. The whisper that took months to hear soon faded into a silence more profound than before. The father now stood at the threshold of spiritual territory no Sunday school lesson had prepared him for. Can you still worship a God who could have saved your child but chose not to? This is the question that would either destroy his faith forever or transform it into something unrecognizable. For the first time in his life, this man entered what spiritual writers have called the dark night of the soul, that barren wasteland where God seems not merely silent but utterly absent. His prayers, once flowing like water, dried up completely. How could he speak to the one who had the power to intervene, but stood back as waters filled his son's lungs? Private rage erupted within him, not the controlled anger deemed acceptable in church circles, but a primal fury that frightened even himself. He had believed the covenant was clear, faithfulness exchanged for divine protection. Now that covenant lay shattered at his feet. His Bible gathered dust on the nightstand. He couldn't bear to touch it. The promises inside mocked him. The psalms of praise felt like lies in his mouth. The words that once flowed through him like living water now turned to sand. I know God could have prevented this tragedy, but he didn't. He wrote in his letter. I know he could have reversed it until the moment of burial, but he chose not to. Raw confession poured from him like blood from a wound. There was no bandaging this truth with comfortable theology. The isolation cut deeper than he expected. Church friends who rushed to his side in the immediate aftermath now grew visibly uncomfortable with grief that refused to transform into a neat testimony. They wanted resurrection without crucifixion, Easter Sunday without Good Friday. Their discomfort with his prolonged mourning left him feeling abandoned twice, first by God, then by God's people. One sleepless night, he opened the Psalms, not seeking comfort, but validation for his anger. There he discovered David's raw laments, Jeremiah's bitter complaints, Job's unanswered questions. These weren't footnotes to faith. They were central chapters. For the first time, he realized questioning God wasn't faithlessness. It was part of biblical faith itself. Sometimes I tell myself it was God's will to comfort myself, he admitted, but I don't really believe it. I don't know how to process any of this. This confession marked the apex of his spiritual crisis, the moment of absolute honesty with himself and with God. The platitudes he'd offered others in their suffering now turned to ash in his mouth as weeks became months. He felt drawn to connect with someone who had walked this same desolate path. Not for answers. He had abandoned hope for those, but for understanding. Could anyone comprehend the war within him? Could anyone show him how to live with both love for God and devastation at his ways? He found himself writing to another father who had buried a child years before. The letter contained no theological questions, just the raw confession of a man standing in rubble where his faith once stood. This act itself, reaching out from the depths of darkness, was the first green shoot emerging from scorched earth. The letter came like water in the desert, not bearing answers, but something far more valuable: understanding. When grief carves you hollow, explanations feel like stones thrown at your wounds. This other father who had walked the same desolate path offered something different: presence in the valley few have the courage to enter. His response began not with theology, but with his own scars. I know what it is to love. Invest life, give everything you have, and then watch your object of love disappear. No platitudes, no divine justifications, just the raw acknowledgement that some pain can only be understood by those who have felt its blade against their own throat. But amidst this shared grief came a challenge that struck at the father's core. A dor é da gente, e somente nossa. The pain is ours, and ours alone. The responder gently redirected the father's understanding of his own anguish. Your son isn't suffering, he suggested. Your son is safe. The pain you feel is not for him, it's for you, for the birthdays you'll never celebrate, for the man you'll never see him become, for the emptiness in your arms that nothing can fill. This distinction lands like lightning. How much of what we call grief for others is actually grief for ourselves? How much of our rage at God is for the futures we believed were promised to us? Then came the question that tore open everything the Father thought he understood about prayer. You prayed as one investing in protection. Your hopes in Christ were only for this world. The words cut clean through years of misunderstanding. The Father had treated prayer like a spiritual insurance policy, regular payments of faith in exchange for a guarantee against tragedy. But what if that was never what prayer was meant to be? What if a father's truest prayer shouldn't be for physical safety at all? What if the worst tragedy isn't a short life that ends in God's presence, but a long life that wanders away from Him? De responde son practicar prayersimen. Almost shocking at first. Eu preferiria sepultar os quatro em um só dia, do que vê-los andando sem o amor de Deus no coração. I would prefer to bury all four in one day than see them living without God's love in their heart. These weren't flippant words written by someone who hadn't counted the cost. These were words written in the ink of actual loss, by hands that had lowered a child into the ground. This perspective challenges everything our culture teaches about parenting. We bubble wrap our children's bodies while leaving their souls exposed to whatever winds might blow. We calculate success in years lived, achievements earned, happiness accumulated, but what if God measures success by entirely different metrics? The letter continued, proposing that true prayer focuses on spiritual salvation rather than mere physical protection. What if physical death, however devastating to those left behind, isn't actually the worst thing that can befall a child? What if our terror of losing a child blinds us to a greater reality? For the first time since the drowning, the Father could see glimpses of a bigger picture. Not one that justified his son's death or made it somehow worth it, but one that created space for meaning beyond the senseless tragedy. His son's life wasn't cut short, it was completed, perfect in its brevity, whole in its purpose. This wasn't about finding the silver lining or claiming God took his son for some cosmic reason. It was about understanding that meaning can emerge even from the most senseless suffering, not in the suffering itself, but in how it transforms our understanding of what truly matters in this life and beyond. Brothers, when the foundations shake beneath your feet, when the very ground you thought was solid turns to quicksand, that is when faith truly begins. Not the comfortable faith of Sunday mornings and answered prayers, but the raw faith that continues to seek even when shrouded in darkness. The Father who watched his son slip beneath those waters has been forged in a fire most cannot comprehend. As Romans 1:17 reminds us, the just shall live by faith, not by understanding, not by having all questions answered, but by continuing to walk forward when the path disappears. True faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to question while still seeking. The hope we have in Christ extends beyond this temporal life, beyond the grief that crushes our chests. For if our hope in Christ were only for this life, we would indeed be most pitiable. But our faith looks beyond the waters of death to the shore where reunion awaits, where a father's arms will once again hold what was lost, where questions dissolve in the light of perfect understanding, and where love proves stronger than the grave.